In World War II, Japan did not lose the war in a single day. It did not begin with firestorms. It did not start with atomic light. Long before the world noticed, Japan made a decision. A quiet one. A calculated one. A decision that did not shock the public. A decision that did not shake the battlefield. And yet, it changed everything. At the time, it seemed reasonable. Even necessary. Many believed it would protect the empire. Many believed it would secure victory. But history does not forgive assumptions. It waits. It observes. And then it collects its debt. This decision did not destroy Japan immediately. It worked slowly. Silently. Month by month. Year by year. Until Japan realized something terrifying. The war was no longer slipping away. It was already lost. And there was no way back. By the early years of World War II, Imperial Japan believed it understood how history worked. It believed that nations rose through courage, sacrifice, and decisive action, and that hesitation was a weakness reserved for fading empires. From the streets of Tokyo to the war rooms of the Imperial General Headquarters, confidence shaped every plan, every map, and every order sent into the Pacific. Japan did not see itself as reckless or desperate. It saw itself as disciplined, prepared, and chosen by fate to reshape Asia. Yet wars are not decided by belief alone. They are shaped by decisions made under pressure, filtered through pride, fear, and incomplete information. Some decisions roar into history with explosions and headlines. Others arrive quietly, disguised as strategy, efficiency, or necessity. These are the decisions that matter most, because they change the direction of a war without anyone realizing it. For Japan, one such decision was made far from the front lines. It did not involve a single battle or a single enemy. It involved how Japan chose to fight the war itself. And once that choice was made, every victory, every loss, and every sacrifice that followed was already moving toward the same unavoidable ending. Before the turning point that would quietly seal its fate, Japan stood at what appeared to be the height of its power. Across East Asia and the Pacific, imperial forces advanced with speed and confidence that shocked the world. Territories fell one after another, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though Japan had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. Victories were celebrated not only as military success, but as proof that destiny itself favored the empire. Inside Japan's leadership, this sense of momentum shaped everything. Military planners believed they had discovered a formula for victory built on rapid strikes, decisive battles, and unbreakable will. They believed that bold action could compensate for limited resources. They believed that spirit could overcome steel. And most importantly, they believed time was on their side. Japan's strategy rested on the assumption that its enemies lacked the patience for a long, grinding war. The United States, in particular, was viewed as powerful but soft, rich but unwilling to bleed for distant islands. If Japan could strike hard enough and fast enough, it believed its enemies would eventually seek compromise rather than total victory. This belief was repeated so often that it hardened into certainty. Culturally, surrender was unthinkable. Retreat was dishonor. Doubt was weakness. These values strengthened Japan's resolve, but they also narrowed its vision. Questions that should have been asked were dismissed. Warnings that did not align with confidence were ignored. From the outside, Japan looked unstoppable. From the inside, however, its future was already being shaped by what it chose not to reconsider. Because long before defeat became visible, Japan had already committed itself to a path that left no room for correction. The decision that would quietly seal Japan's fate did not come with celebration or dramatic speeches. There were no headlines announcing it to the public. No single moment that felt historic at the time. Instead, it emerged slowly, through meetings, memorandums, and assumptions that went largely unchallenged. Japan chose to fight a short war. Not officially, not on paper, but in mindset. Its leadership committed to a strategy that depended on quick victories and psychological shock rather than long-term endurance. They believed that decisive early blows would force their enemies to negotiate before industrial strength could be fully unleashed. In doing so, Japan shaped every aspect of its war planning around speed, initiative, and the hope of exhaustion on the other side. This decision influenced shipbuilding priorities. It influenced aircraft design. It influenced training, logistics, and even how losses were calculated. Japan invested heavily in offensive power, but far less in sustainability. Supply lines were stretched. Replacement systems were thin. Industrial capacity was treated as a secondary concern, not a deciding factor. At the time, this approach felt logical. Japan lacked the raw resources of its enemies. It could not outproduce the United States. So it chose to outmaneuver it. To shock it. To intimidate it into stopping. What Japan underestimated was not enemy strength, but enemy adaptation. It assumed that early pain would lead to early peace. It did not fully consider what would happen if the war continued beyond its opening act. By committing to a strategy built on urgency rather than endurance, Japan quietly limited its own future options. Once this decision settled into doctrine, it became difficult to challenge. Changing course would have meant admitting vulnerability. It would have meant questioning the very foundation of Japan's wartime confidence. So the strategy remained in place, even as circumstances began to shift. And without realizing it, Japan had already chosen how the war would end. At the moment it was made, Japan's decision did not feel reckless or doomed. To many inside the leadership, it felt realistic. Even responsible. Japan understood its limitations better than most outsiders believed. It knew it could not win a long industrial war against nations with vast factories, oil reserves, and manpower. So the logic appeared simple. If endurance was impossible, speed became essential. Japanese planners studied recent history and drew dangerous conclusions. They looked at how quickly France had fallen. They believed morale, not material, decided modern wars. They assumed that sudden shock could fracture even the strongest societies. From this perspective, a short, violent conflict seemed not only possible, but likely. There was also immense internal pressure. Military leaders feared that hesitation would signal weakness. Political leaders feared losing control to rival factions. No one wanted to be remembered as the man who doubted Japan's destiny. Agreement was safer than caution. Confidence was rewarded. Questions were not. Cultural beliefs reinforced these assumptions. Sacrifice was valued over survival. Spirit was elevated above logistics. To endure endless war was seen as dishonorable. To strike boldly, even at great risk, was admired. These values shaped strategy as much as maps and intelligence reports. Japan also misunderstood its enemy. It believed democracies would collapse under sustained loss. It believed public opinion would force negotiation. It failed to grasp how deeply industrial societies could mobilize once fully committed. What seemed like enemy weakness was, in reality, delayed strength. In this environment, the decision felt justified. It aligned with culture. It aligned with fear. It aligned with hope. But history rarely rewards decisions made only within the echo of one's own certainty. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Japan continued to win battles. Territories were still held. The empire still appeared strong on maps and in headlines. But beneath the surface, the consequences of the decision were already spreading. The war did not end quickly. Instead, it stretched forward, month after month. And with every passing month, Japan's strategy began to reveal its weakness. Ships lost in battle were not easily replaced. Experienced pilots, once gone, could not be trained again at the same speed. Factories worked, but they could not match the scale of enemy production. Each loss carried more weight than the last. Supply lines became fragile. Oil shortages quietly dictated where fleets could sail and where aircraft could fly. Garrisons were isolated. Resources were diverted from defense to offense, even as the front lines grew wider and harder to sustain. Japan had built a war machine designed to strike fast, not to endure pressure. Meanwhile, Japan's enemies were learning. They adapted tactics. They improved technology. They reorganized production on a scale Japan had never imagined. What began as a confident race for early victory slowly turned into a test of endurance that Japan had never planned to face. The most dangerous consequence was psychological. Because the strategy was never meant for a long war, there was no clear alternative once momentum slowed. Leaders clung to the original plan, hoping the next battle would change everything. Each setback was explained as temporary. Each warning was dismissed as defeatism. By the time the signs became impossible to ignore, the damage was already done. Japan was fighting a war it had not prepared for. A war of attrition. A war of factories, fuel, and time. And time, once believed to be Japan's ally, had quietly become its greatest enemy. The decision had not failed loudly. It had failed patiently. And with every day that passed, it narrowed Japan's options, one silent consequence at a time. There came a point when Japan's leaders understood, even if they did not openly admit it, that the war was no longer unfolding according to plan. The early assumptions had collapsed one by one. Quick victory had not arrived. Negotiation had not followed shock. Instead, the enemy grew stronger, more organized, and more relentless with every passing month. By this stage, Japan faced a cruel reality. Changing strategy now would require time, resources, and industrial strength it no longer possessed. The foundations for endurance had never been built. Shipyards could not replace losses fast enough. Pilot training programs had been shortened to meet desperate needs, producing quantity instead of experience. Fuel shortages dictated operations more than strategy ever did. Every option carried consequences. To retreat would mean abandoning territory paid for in blood. To defend would mean stretching already thin supply lines even further. To escalate would mean gambling with forces that could not be replaced. There were no good choices left, only different forms of loss. Inside the leadership, silence became common. Disagreements were muted. Doubt was internalized. Publicly, confidence remained. Privately, the understanding grew that the window for reversal had closed long ago. Japan continued to fight with courage and sacrifice. But courage could not create oil. Sacrifice could not build factories. And determination could not reverse a decision made years earlier. The war had reached a stage where outcomes were shaped less by intention and more by momentum. Japan was no longer directing the course of events. It was responding to them. The path forward was no longer chosen. It was endured. This was the moment when Japan could not turn back. Not because it lacked will, but because the quiet decision that shaped the war had already removed every road that led elsewhere. As the war moved into its final phase, the results of Japan's earlier decision became impossible to separate from its fate. Battles were still fought. Lives were still sacrificed. But the direction of the war had already been set long before these final struggles began. Japan was no longer fighting to shape the future. It was fighting to delay the inevitable. Enemy forces advanced with overwhelming material superiority. Their factories produced ships, aircraft, and weapons faster than Japan could destroy them. Losses that would have once shocked the Imperial command now became routine. Each battle drained strength that could not be restored. Each defense bought time, but at a growing and irreversible cost. Cities began to suffer. Infrastructure collapsed under sustained pressure. The civilian population, once distant from the front lines, now felt the weight of a war that could no longer be contained. What had started as a strategy built on speed and control ended in exhaustion and scarcity. Japan's leadership faced a reality shaped not by a single defeat, but by cumulative consequence. There was no decisive battle left that could change the outcome. No sudden victory that could erase years of imbalance. The war's ending was no longer a question of if, but how much more would be lost before it arrived. When the conflict finally came to its conclusion, it felt less like a sudden collapse and more like the closing of a long, narrowing corridor. Every step along that corridor had been shaped by the same early choice. A choice that once promised victory. A choice that ultimately defined defeat. Japan's fate had not been sealed in its final days. It had been sealed quietly, patiently, years earlier. History often remembers wars through explosions, surrender documents, and final battles. But the truth is rarely that loud. Most wars are decided long before their endings are announced. They are shaped quietly, by choices that seem reasonable in their moment and irreversible in hindsight. Japan's defeat in World War II was not caused by a lack of courage. It was not caused by a single lost battle. It was shaped by one fundamental decision about how the war would be fought. A decision that prioritized speed over endurance. Confidence over flexibility. Hope over preparation. Once that choice was made, everything that followed moved within its shadow. Victories delayed the truth. Defeats revealed it. And time, the one resource Japan could not replace, slowly exposed the cost of that early certainty. This is how history truly works. Not with sudden collapse, but with quiet commitment. Not with dramatic announcements, but with paths chosen and never questioned again. The most powerful forces in war are not always weapons or armies. Sometimes, they are ideas. Assumptions. And decisions made when the future still looks open. Because once the path is chosen, history does not ask if you are ready. It simply follows through.